For centuries, the corridors of European palaces echoed with whispered conversations about bloodlines, inheritance, and the sacred duty of preserving royal dynasties. In the flickering candlelight of castle chambers, marriages were arranged not for love, but for the continuation of power. This is the story of how the pursuit of pure bloodlines created some of history's most tragic figures, and how the very women meant to secure these dynasties often became their greatest casualties. The concept of royal blood was more than metaphor in medieval and early modern Europe. It was believed to carry divine right, political legitimacy, and the essence of rulership itself. To dilute this blood with commoner lineage was seen as weakening not just the family but the very foundation of monarchical authority. This belief would drive royal families into increasingly narrow marriage patterns, creating webs of kinship that stretched across generations and continents. In the great halls of Versailles, the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and the Alcazar in Madrid, royal children learned early that their marriages would serve the state before their hearts. Young princesses were often promised to cousins, uncles, or nephews, while still in their cradles, their lives predetermined by genealogical charts that mapped not romance but political alliance and bloodline preservation. The House of Habsburg emerged as perhaps history's most dramatic example of this practice. Originating in Switzerland in the 11th century, they would eventually control vast territories across Europe, from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to parts of Italy. Their motto, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry," reflected their strategic use of matrimony as a tool of expansion and consolidation. Within Habsburg family trees, the same names appear repeatedly across generations, creating a complex web where individuals were simultaneously cousins, nieces, aunts, and in-laws to the same relative. Charles II of Spain, who would become one of history's most tragic royal figures, was the product of generations of such intermarriage, with a family tree that resembled more of a family circle. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs provides a particularly poignant example of how these practices affected royal women. Maria Anna of Austria, born in 1635, was simultaneously the niece and wife of Philip I of Spain. Her life exemplified the constraints placed on royal women. Married to secure political alliance, expected to produce heirs to continue the bloodline, yet given little agency in determining her own destiny. The political motivations behind these marriages were complex and far-reaching. When royal families intermarried, they weren't just joining two people, they were merging territorial claims, trade agreements, military alliances, and religious affiliations. A princess marrying into a foreign royal house carried with her not just her bloodline, but also potential claims to thrones, rights to succession, and obligations to support her birth family's interests. In the courts of Europe, genealogists held positions of tremendous importance, maintaining detailed records of bloodlines that stretched back centuries. These family trees were more than historical documents. They were legal instruments that could justify wars, support territorial claims, or legitimize rule. The purity of these bloodlines became a matter of state security. The women caught in these matrimonial strategies often found themselves in impossible positions. Take Maria Theresa of Spain, who married Louis XIV of France. This union was designed to cement peace between France and Spain, but Maria Theresa was required to renounce her claims to the Spanish succession in exchange for a dowry that was never fully paid. Her marriage secured peace for a generation, but at the cost of her inheritance rights. Royal women of this era were educated from childhood to understand their role as vessels for dynasty preservation. They learned languages, not for personal enrichment, but to communicate with future foreign husbands. They studied genealogy to understand their place in the intricate web of European nobility. They practiced courtly manners that would help them navigate foreign courts, where they might one day reign. The pressure on these women to produce heirs was immense and unrelenting. Queens and princesses who failed to conceive, or who produced only daughters, faced not just personal disappointment, but political crisis. Their worth was often measured primarily by their fertility, and their failures in this regard could determine the fate of nations. Margaret Teresa of Spain, born in 1651, illustrates this burden perfectly. As the daughter of Philip IV, she was betrothed to her uncle Leopold I of Austria. When she was just 3 years old, her entire upbringing was focused on preparing her for this marriage, which would strengthen the Habsburg alliance between the Spanish and Austrian branches. Her life was never truly her own. The physical and psychological toll of these arranged marriages was severe. Royal women were often married very young, sometimes before they reached physical maturity. They were expected to consummate marriages with men they barely knew, often their own relatives, and to do so gladly for the good of the realm. The emotional cost of such arrangements was rarely considered in the political calculations that drove them. Letters and diaries from royal women of this period reveal the human cost of these dynastic strategies. They write of homesickness, loneliness, and the challenge of loving husbands chosen for them by political necessity. Some developed deep affections for their arranged spouses, while others endured marriages that were little more than diplomatic contracts made flesh. The practice of cousin marriage was so common among European royalty that it created a remarkably small gene pool at the highest levels of society. Mathematical analysis of royal family trees reveals that by the 17th and 18th centuries, European royalty had become more genetically similar to each other than many members of the same extended family in the general population. This genetic convergence had consequences that extended far beyond individual health. The increasing similarity between royal bloodlines meant that hemophilia, porphyria, and other genetic conditions began appearing with alarming frequency in royal family. What had been intended to preserve and strengthen royal blood was actually weakening it in ways that contemporary medicine couldn't yet understand. The Spanish Habsburgs provide perhaps the most dramatic example of these consequences. By the time Charles II ascended to the throne in 1665, his family tree showed that his parents were related in at least 7 different ways. His genetic inheritance was so compromised that he suffered from numerous physical and mental disabilities that made effective rule nearly impossible. But it wasn't just the male heirs who suffered. Royal women bore the brunt of these genetic consequences in multiple ways. They not only inherited the health problems themselves, but also carried the burden of potentially passing them on to their children. A queen who couldn't produce healthy heirs faced blame and potential divorce, regardless of the genetic factors beyond her control. The case of Marie Antoinette, though from a later period, illustrates how royal women continued to bear responsibility for dynastic failures long after the genetic causes should have been apparent. Her difficulty in conceiving and her production of daughters before finally bearing a male heir led to whispered accusations about her fitness as a queen, despite the fact that fertility and the sex of children are largely beyond maternal control. Throughout this period, royal women developed remarkable resilience and found ways to exert influence despite their constrained circumstance. Some became powerful political figures in their own right, using their positions as mothers of heirs or as regents to shape policy and protect their interests. Others became patrons of arts and learning, creating cultural legacies that outlasted the political arrangements that brought them to power. The Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, despite being herself the product of careful dynastic marriage planning, proved to be one of history's most capable rulers. When she inherited the Austrian throne in 1740, she faced immediate challenges to her legitimacy precisely because she was a woman ruling in her own right, rather than as a consort. Yet she successfully defended her inheritance and modernized her realm, all while bearing 16 children to continue the Habsburg line. Her approach to arranging marriages for her own children reveals the continuing influence of dynastic thinking well into the 18th. She carefully planned matches for each of her children that would strengthen Austria's position in European politics, famously arranging for her daughter Marie Antoinette to marry the future Louis XV of France to cement the Franco-Austrian alliance. The letters Maria Theresa exchanged with her daughters after their marriages provide intimate insight into the emotional complexity of dynastic marriage. She offered advice on managing relationships with husbands chosen for political reasons, guidance on court protocol in foreign lands, and support for the challenges of producing heirs while maintaining political influence. Religious considerations added another layer of complexity to royal marriage patterns. In Catholic Europe, papal dispensations were required for marriages between close relatives, creating a formal church bureaucracy around royal incest. The Vatican's archives contain thousands of documents related to these dispensations, revealing the extent to which the Church became complicit in genetic concentration among ruling families. The Protestant Reformation created new dynamics in royal marriage politics. Protestant royal families could no longer rely on papal dispensations for close relative marriages, leading to different marriage patterns in Protestant versus Catholic realms. However, the basic principle of keeping marriages within the narrow circle of ruling families remained consistent across religious lines. The rise of Protestantism also created new opportunities and challenges for royal women. Some Protestant territories allowed female inheritance more readily than Catholic ones, creating opportunities for women to rule in their own right. However, these same territories often faced pressure to form Catholic marriages for diplomatic reasons, forcing Protestant princesses to convert upon marriage, or creating religiously divided royal couples. The 30 Years' War 1618–1648 dramatically illustrated how royal marriages had become weapons of religious and political warfare. The conflict began partly due to disputes over religious practices in Bohemia, but it quickly became entangled with the complex web of marriage alliances that connected European royal families. Relatives found themselves on opposing sides of a devastating conflict that reshaped the European political landscape. During this period, royal women often found themselves caught between loyalty to their birth families and their married families when conflicts arose. Some became skilled diplomatic intermediaries, using their dual loyalties to negotiate truces or treaties. Others faced the heartbreak of seeing their birth countries and adopted countries at war with each other. The Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War in 1648 was itself secured partly through strategic royal marriages planned as part of the treaty negotiation. Princess Maria Ana of Austria was married to Philip III of Spain, specifically to cement the Spanish-Austrian alliance that emerged from the peace negotiations. Her marriage was literally written into the treaty terms. As the 17th century progressed, the health consequences of intensive inbreeding became increasingly apparent to royal families, even if the genetic mechanisms weren't yet understood. Court physicians began documenting patterns of illness and disability that seemed to run in royal families, though they attributed these to corrupted humors or divine displeasure rather than genetic factors. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles became a showcase for both the grandeur and the costs of dynastic marriage. The Sun King himself married his Spanish cousin Maria Theresa in 1660, but their children suffered from various health problems that would plague the next generation of French royalty. Despite the political success of the marriage in securing peace with Spain, the genetic costs were becoming apparent. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, who married Charles II of Spain in 1679, provides a poignant example of how royal women experienced the reality of dynastic marriage. Her letters home to France describe the challenges of life with a husband whose health problems made normal marital relations difficult. She struggled with loneliness and the pressure to produce an heir with a man who was likely sterile due to his genetic inheritance. The death of Marie-Louise under mysterious circumstances in 1689 sparked diplomatic tensions between France and Spain, illustrating how the personal struggles of royal women could have international implications. Her inability to produce an heir contributed to the succession crisis that would eventually lead to the War of Spanish Succession after Charles II's death. The second wife of Charles II, Maria Ana of Neuburg, faced even greater challenges. Married to the Spanish king in 1690, she found herself blamed for his continued failure to produce an heir, despite medical evidence suggesting the problem lay with Charles himself. Her position became increasingly precarious as it became clear that the Spanish Habsburg line would end with her husband. The War of Spanish Succession 1701–1714 erupted precisely because of the failure of dynastic marriage to produce a clear succession. Despite centuries of careful breeding to preserve Habsburg blood, the line died out with Charles II, leaving competing claimants related through various royal marriages to fight for the Spanish throne. The very system designed to prevent such conflicts had ultimately caused them. Royal women found themselves central to these succession disputes in complex ways. Their marriage contracts, inheritance rights, and the legitimacy of their children became matters of international law and military conflict. The Treaty of Utrecht that ended the war included detailed provisions about which royal marriages would be recognized, and which inheritance claims would be honored. The early 18th century saw some recognition of the problems inherent in intensive royal inbreeding. But old habits died hard. The House of Bourbon, which inherited the Spanish throne after the Habsburg extinction, initially tried to diversify their marriage patterns but gradually reverted to familiar patterns of cousin marriage within a generation. The rise of Prussia as a major European power introduced new dynamics into royal marriage politics. The Hohenzollern dynasty used strategic marriages to legitimize their claims to great power status, but they were also somewhat more willing to marry outside the traditional circles of European royalty. This approach may have contributed to their political success in the 18th century. Catherine the Great of Russia, though not herself born into the highest tier of European royalty, used marriage and the promise of marriage to build political alliances throughout Europe. Her court became a destination for second-tier European nobility, seeking advantageous matches, creating new networks of kinship that bypassed some of the traditional inbreeding patterns. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, again demonstrated how royal marriages had become integral to European warfare. The conflict was partly triggered by the diplomatic revolution that saw France and Austria become allies, a shift partly cemented by the marriage of Marie Antoinette to the French Dauphin. Old marriage alliances were broken, and new ones formed as the European balance of power shifted. During this period, royal women began to exert more influence over their own marriage arrangements, though still within strict limits. Some managed to delay unwanted marriages through various stratagems, while others used their positions as mothers to influence the marriage arrangements of the next generation. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia, for example, chose her nephew's wife partly based on her own preferences rather than purely political considerations. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about marriage, love, and individual rights that began to challenge traditional dynastic marriage practice. Philosophers like Voltaire wrote critically about arranged marriages, while novels celebrating romantic love became popular in royal courts. However, these intellectual currents only slowly influenced actual royal marriage practice. Frederick the Great of Prussia shocked European courts by refusing to consummate his arranged marriage and living separately from his wife for most of their marriage. While his personal choices were attributed to his possible homosexuality, his defiance of marriage norms also reflected broader Enlightenment questioning of traditional institutions. The American Revolution introduced new Republican ideals that challenged the entire concept of hereditary monarchy and, by extension, the dynastic marriages that sustained it. Some European royal families began to worry that their marriage practices made them appear backward and tyrannical compared to the democratic ideals emerging in America. Marie Antoinette became a symbol of royal excess, partly because her Austrian birth made her seem foreign to French subjects increasingly critical of dynastic politics. Her marriage, originally intended to strengthen the Franco-Austrian alliance, instead became a liability as French public opinion turned against foreign influence in their government. The French Revolution brought the contradictions of dynastic marriage into sharp focus. Revolutionary criticism of the royal family often centered on their foreign connections and the ways their marriages served foreign interests, rather than French ones. The execution of Marie Antoinette in 1793 represented a violent rejection of the entire system of dynastic marriage that had shaped European politics for centuries. However, even the French Revolution didn't immediately end dynastic marriage practice. Napoleon, despite his revolutionary origins, used marriage alliances to legitimize his empire and integrate himself into European royal networks. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 was a deliberate attempt to gain acceptance from traditional European royalty. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 partially restored the old European order, including renewed emphasis on dynastic marriage as a tool of diplomacy. However, the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic periods had permanently altered European politics, and royal marriages would never again carry quite the same weight in international relations. The 19th century saw continued royal intermarriage, but with growing awareness of the genetic risks involved. Queen Victoria of Britain, despite being herself the product of a strategic dynastic marriage, began to express concerns about the health consequences of cousin marriage after observing the effects in her own extended family. The spread of hemophilia through Victoria's descendants became known as the royal disease, providing a clear example of how genetic conditions could spread through interconnected royal families. Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra, who married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, carried the gene that would affect her son Alexei and indirectly contribute to the fall of the Russian monarchy. The case of Alexandra illustrates how royal women continued to bear disproportionate responsibility for genetic inheritance they couldn't control. She was blamed for her son's hemophilia and for bringing Rasputin into the Russian court, despite the fact that the genetic condition came through her grandmother Victoria's line and affected royal families throughout Europe. As the 19th century progressed, romantic marriage became more acceptable even among royalty, though political considerations remained important. Queen Victoria herself experienced a famously loving marriage to Prince Albert, and she encouraged somewhat more freedom in marriage choices for her children, though still within the bounds of dynastic appropriateness. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of middle-class power began to change the context in which royal marriages occurred. Monarchies that failed to adapt to changing social conditions faced revolutionary pressure, and overly insular royal families began to appear increasingly out of touch with their subjects' experiences. World War I represented the final collapse of the old European order built around dynastic marriage. The war pitted cousin against cousin, as the royal families of Britain, Germany and Russia found themselves on opposing sides of a devastating conflict, despite their close family relationships. The fall of the German, Austrian and Russian empires after World War I eliminated three of the major players in European dynastic marriage politics. The surviving monarchies began to adopt different approaches to royal marriage, with some showing greater willingness to marry outside traditional royal circles. The 20th century brought scientific understanding of genetics that finally explained the health problems that had plagued inbred royal families for centuries. This knowledge gradually influenced royal marriage practices, though change came slowly to such traditional institutions. Modern royal families have largely abandoned the intensive inbreeding that characterized earlier periods, though they continue to face pressure to marry within appropriate social circles. The balance between personal choice and dynastic responsibility continues to evolve as monarchies adapt to democratic societies. The legacy of centuries of dynastic marriage can still be seen in the complex relationships between European royal families today. Genealogical analysis reveals that most current European royalty descend from Queen Victoria, creating a family network that spans the continent despite the political changes of the past century. Contemporary royal women enjoy far greater freedom in choosing their spouses than their predecessors, though they still face public scrutiny and expectations about their marriages. The integration of commoners into royal families through marriage has brought new vitality to royal bloodlines, while maintaining the symbolic importance of monarchy in modern democratic society. The story of royal women and dynastic marriage ultimately reveals the human cost of treating people as political instruments. While these marriages shaped European history and created the political framework that governed the continent for centuries, they also trapped individuals in relationships and roles determined by forces beyond their control. Understanding this history helps illuminate not just the development of European politics, but also the broader human struggle between individual desires and social expectations. The royal women caught in these dynastic webs were both powerful and powerless, privileged and constrained, symbols of their nations and prisoners of their bloodline. Their stories remind us that behind every historical abstraction like alliance or dynasty were real people making difficult choices within narrow constraints. The preservation of royal bloodlines that seemed so important to previous generations ultimately proved less significant than the human relationships and individual lives that were sacrificed in its pursuit. The gradual abandonment of intensive royal inbreeding represents not just medical progress, but also evolving ideas about human dignity and personal autonomy. While royal marriages continue to carry political and symbolic significance, the recognition that individuals deserve choice in their most intimate relationships marks an important development in human rights consciousness. As we reflect on this complex history, we can appreciate both the political sophistication of dynastic marriage systems and their human costs. The royal women who navigated these systems with grace and dignity deserve recognition not just as historical figures, but as individuals who found ways to exert agency and create meaning within constrained circumstances. Their legacy extends beyond the political alliances they helped create or the bloodlines they preserved. They also left behind examples of resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to find purpose and even happiness within difficult circumstances. Their stories continue to resonate because they illuminate timeless themes about power, family, love, and the price of putting political necessity above personal choice. The Portuguese royal family offers another fascinating case study in the effects of dynastic intermarriage. Maria of Portugal, who ruled from 1777 to 1816, was the product of generations of careful Habsburg Bourbon intermarriage. Her marriage to her own uncle, Pedro III, was arranged to keep Portuguese succession within the family, but the genetic consequences became apparent in her later mental illness, which eventually required her son to serve as regent. The concept of blue blood took on tragic literal meaning in the Spanish Habsburg line, where the characteristic protruding lower jaw became so pronounced that eating and speaking became difficult. This physical manifestation of genetic concentration served as a visible reminder of the costs of preserving pure royal bloodlines, yet the practice continued because the political benefits seemed to outweigh the personal costs. Court artists of the period faced the delicate challenge of portraying royal family members whose genetic inheritance had created physical abnormalities. Painters like Diego Velázquez had to balance honesty in their portraits with the need to maintain royal dignity, creating works that subtly revealed the effects of inbreeding while still serving their ceremonial purpose. The development of court etiquette around these issues reveals the extent to which royal disability was both acknowledged and concealed. Special protocols were developed for meals where rulers had difficulty eating, and court ceremonies were modified to accommodate physical limitations while maintaining the appearance of royal authority and divine blessing. Maria Ana of Spain, sister to Charles II, experienced the particular burden of being a royal woman whose value was entirely tied to her potential as a bride, yet whose genetic inheritance made successful marriage and childbearing unlikely. Her life was spent in constant preparation for marriages that were repeatedly postponed or cancelled as her brother's health declined and the political situation changed. The role of royal physicians in these arrangements was both crucial and constrained. Court doctors observed the effects of inbreeding but lacked the scientific framework to understand genetics. They prescribed treatments based on humoral theory and attempted to address symptoms without comprehending the underlying causes, often blaming the women themselves for their inability to produce healthy heirs. Letters between royal mothers and daughters reveal the informal networks of knowledge that developed around managing the health problems associated with dynastic marriage. Experienced queens would share advice about pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing with their daughters facing similar challenges, creating a parallel medical knowledge system based on practical experience rather than formal theory. The economic costs of intensive royal inbreeding extended far beyond individual health problems. Courts had to maintain large medical staffs, specialized equipment for disabled royals, and often regencies or councils to govern when rulers were incapacitated. These expenses strained royal treasuries already burdened by the costs of maintaining dynastic prestige through elaborate ceremonies and palace construction. The Duchess of Alba, despite her lower position in the Spanish nobility hierarchy, became a subject of court fascination, partly because her relative genetic distance from the royal line made her an attractive potential bride for royal heirs seeking to introduce new bloodlines. Her portrait by Francisco Goya captures not just individual beauty but also the appeal of genetic diversity in a highly inbred royal environment. Religious interpretation of royal genetic problems created additional burdens for royal women who were often seen as either blessed or cursed by divine will. Queens who produced healthy heirs were credited with God's favor, while those who suffered miscarriages or bore children with disabilities faced whispered accusations of moral failing or divine displeasure. The Sullic law, which prevented female inheritance in many European kingdoms, created a cruel irony, where royal women were essential for producing male heirs, but were themselves excluded from succession. This legal framework intensified pressure on royal wives and mothers, while denying them the ultimate political authority that might have allowed them to reform the marriage practices that constrained them. Royal convents became refuges for princesses, whose genetic inheritance or political circumstances made them unmarriageable. These institutions provided dignity and purpose for women who might otherwise have been seen as dynastic failures, allowing them to contribute to their families' prestige through religious, rather than reproductive service. The development of portrait miniatures as diplomatic tools reveals how royal women's images were circulated as part of marriage negotiations long before the principals ever met. These carefully crafted representations had to balance accuracy with attractiveness, creating idealized versions of potential brides that sometimes bore little resemblance to reality. The practice of proxy marriage, where representatives stood in for absent royal brides during wedding ceremonies, highlights the extent to which these women were treated as political commodities rather than individuals. Princesses might be married to men they had never seen, with the first meeting occurring only when they arrived in their new countries to consummate unions already legally binding. Court astrologers and fortune-tellers gained influence by offering explanations for the genetic problems plaguing royal families, attributing disabilities and fertility issues to planetary alignments, family curses, or supernatural influence. These alternative explanations provided psychological comfort, while obscuring the real causes of royal health problems. The War of Austrian Succession, 1740–1748, demonstrated how female succession could disrupt carefully laid dynastic plans. Maria Theresa's inheritance of the Austrian throne challenged the assumptions underlying male preference primogeniture and forced European powers to reconsider the role of women in dynastic succession, though this reconsideration proceeded slowly and unevenly. Royal women who survived to old age often became powerful matriarchs who influenced marriage arrangements for subsequent generations. The Empress Maria Theresa used her experience and authority to carefully plan matches for her 16 children, but even her wisdom couldn't overcome the limited gene pool available within European royalty. The practice of royal women maintaining correspondence with their birth families after marriage created informal diplomatic channels that sometimes proved more effective than formal negotiation. These letters reveal how royal women served as cultural ambassadors, reporting on foreign court practices and maintaining family connections that could prove politically valuable during international crises. The development of specialized medical treatments for royal genetic conditions led to advances in court medicine that eventually benefited broader population. Royal patronage of medical research, driven by desperate attempts to address hereditary health problems, contributed to the gradual development of more sophisticated understanding of human inheritance and disease. The phenomenon of royal changelings, rumors that sickly royal infants had been replaced with healthy commoner children, reflects popular awareness of the genetic problems plaguing royal family. These conspiracy theories, while almost certainly false, reveal contemporary recognition that something was seriously wrong with royal bloodlines. Royal funeral practices evolved to accommodate the reality that many members of royal families died young or suffered from visible disability. Elaborate ceremonies and artistic representations in death often attempted to restore the dignity and beauty that genetic inheritance had compromised in life, creating idealized versions of rulers whose actual appearance might have undermined royal mystique. The role of royal wet nurses and governesses became more important as genetic problems made royal mothers less likely to successfully breastfeed or care for their children. These women, often selected from genetically distant populations, inadvertently introduced some genetic diversity into royal households through their influence on royal children's development and health. Court entertainment evolved to accommodate royal family members whose genetic inheritance limited their participation in traditional activity. New forms of music, theater, and games were developed that could include physically compromised rulers, creating cultural innovations that reflected the practical challenges of maintaining royal dignity despite genetic disability. The practice of royal pilgrimage to religious shrines often masked medical tourism, as royal families sought miracle cures for genetic conditions that contemporary medicine couldn't address. These journeys served multiple purposes, demonstrating royal piety while pursuing alternative treatments for hereditary health problems. The development of royal genealogy as a formal discipline was driven partly by the need to track and potentially avoid the most problematic genetic combination. Professional genealogists became skilled at identifying family lines that carried specific health risks, though their recommendations were often overruled by political necessity. Royal women who failed to produce male heirs faced the additional burden of knowing that their genetic contribution to the dynasty might be evaluated negatively by history. This awareness shaped their behavior and self-perception, creating psychological pressures that extended far beyond the immediate challenges of court life and marriage politics. The practice of royal women serving as regents for their minor children provided opportunities for political influence that were otherwise denied to them. However, these regencies were often complicated by questions about the genetic fitness of the children for whom they were governing, creating additional challenges for women already struggling with limited authority. Court ceremonies around royal births became increasingly elaborate, partly to celebrate successful reproduction in families where healthy offspring couldn't be taken for granted. The survival of royal infants to adulthood was genuinely remarkable given the genetic challenges they faced, making each successful birth a cause for exceptional celebration. The tradition of royal women patronizing hospitals and charitable institutions often reflected personal experience with disability and medical challenges within their own family. This patronage provided meaningful outlets for women whose reproductive failures or genetic inheritance might otherwise have left them feeling useless to their dynasty. The development of specialized royal education programs attempted to prepare genetically compromised heirs for the challenges of rule. These curricula had to balance traditional royal training with practical accommodations for physical and mental disabilities, creating innovative approaches to education that sometimes influenced broader pedagogical development. Royal marriage contracts became increasingly detailed documents that attempted to address the practical challenges of genetic inheritance. These agreements specified everything from medical care arrangements to succession protocols for children born with disabilities, revealing growing awareness of the problems associated with dynastic intermarriage. The role of royal confessors became more complex as they counseled rulers, struggling with the moral implications of arranged marriages that produced suffering children. These religious advisors had to balance theological teachings about marriage and procreation with the practical realities of genetic inheritance and dynastic necessity. Court fashion evolved to help conceal the physical manifestations of genetic problems while maintaining royal dignity. Specialized clothing, jewelry, and accessories were developed to minimize the appearance of physical abnormalities, creating distinctive royal styles that served practical as well as aesthetic purposes. The practice of royal women writing memoirs and maintaining detailed correspondence provides invaluable insight into their personal experiences of dynastic marriage and genetic inheritance.
These documents reveal the emotional cost of political marriages and the personal strategies women developed for coping with constrained circumstances.
Royal libraries and art collections often reflected the intellectual pursuits that provided refuge from the challenges of dynastic duty. Women who couldn't fulfill traditional reproductive roles sometimes became noted patrons of learning and culture, leaving cultural legacies that outlasted the political arrangements that constrained their personal lives. The tradition of royal women serving as godmothers to children throughout Europe created informal networks of influence and support that transcended political boundaries. These relationships provided emotional sustenance and practical assistance for women who might otherwise have been isolated by the unique challenges of royal life. Court physicians' records from this period provide detailed documentation of the health problems associated with intensive royal inbreeding, creating an invaluable medical archive that contributed to eventual understanding of genetic inheritance. These documents, preserved in royal archives throughout Europe, offer scientific insight into the long-term effects of genetic concentration. The development of diplomatic immunity and special protocols for royal marriages reflected growing awareness that these unions were inherently fragile due to the health problems of the participants. International law evolved to address the unique challenges of marriages between genetically compromised royal partners. Royal women's roles as cultural mediators between courts became more important as genetic problems made direct diplomatic contact between rulers more difficult. Women who could travel and negotiate on behalf of disabled husbands or children gained influence and authority that might otherwise have been denied to them. The practice of royal families maintaining multiple residences partly reflected the need to accommodate the medical requirements of genetically compromised family members. Different palaces were equipped for different types of disabilities, and seasonal moves often followed medical, rather than political calendar. The phenomenon of popular devotion to particular royal women often reflected public sympathy for their personal struggles with genetic inheritance and dynastic duty. Queens and princesses who visibly suffered from the constraints of royal marriage sometimes became subjects of folk sympathy and religious veneration. The gradual abandonment of the most intensive forms of royal inbreeding in the late 18th and early 19th centuries reflected not just scientific advancement, but also changing political philosophies that placed greater emphasis on individual welfare and effective. The recognition that genetic diversity strengthened rather than weakened royal families marked a crucial turning point in European royal culture. Modern genetic analysis of preserved royal remains has confirmed the extent of genetic problems in historical royal families, while providing scientific validation for the health problems documented in historical records. This research offers unprecedented insight into the biological consequences of centuries of dynastic intermarriage. The lasting impact of this history can be seen in contemporary royal marriage practices, which generally avoid the close relative marriages that characterized earlier periods while still maintaining appropriate social boundaries. Modern royal families have largely learned from the tragic examples of their predecessors while preserving the ceremonial and symbolic aspects of monarchy. The study of royal genetic inheritance has contributed significantly to modern understanding of human genetics, providing clear examples of how genetic concentration affects human population. The tragic personal experiences of historical royal families have ultimately benefited broader human knowledge and medical practice. The stories of royal women caught in these dynastic webs continue to fascinate contemporary audiences because they illuminate timeless tensions between individual desire and social obligation. Their experiences remind us that behind every grand historical narrative are personal stories of courage, adaptation, and human resilience in the face of circumstances beyond individual control. Understanding this history helps us appreciate both the sophistication of historical political systems and their human cost. The preservation of royal bloodlines that seemed so crucial to earlier generations ultimately proved less important than the individual lives and relationships that were shaped by these practices. The evolution away from intensive royal inbreeding represents progress not just in medical understanding, but also in recognition of human dignity and the importance of individual choice. choice in intimate relationships. While royal marriages continue to carry symbolic significance, the acknowledgement that genetic diversity strengthens families and societies marks an important development in human understanding. As we reflect on these historical patterns, we can recognize the courage and resilience of the women who navigated these complex systems while working to protect their families and preserve their dignity. Their legacy extends far beyond the political alliances they helped create, encompassing examples of human adaptation and the gradual recognition of individual rights within powerful institutional constraints. The case of Isabella Clara Eugenia of Spain provides a compelling example of how royal women adapted to genetic challenges while maintaining political effectiveness. Born in 1566, as the daughter of Philip II, she inherited the Habsburg jaw and other physical characteristics associated with inbreeding, yet she became one of the most capable rulers of her generation, governing the Spanish Netherlands with remarkable skill and diplomatic acumen. The phenomenon of royal medical tourism became increasingly common as families sought treatments for genetic conditions across Europe. Royal women often led these expeditions, traveling from court to court in search of physicians, healers, or religious figures who might offer hope for their afflicted children or themselves, creating informal networks of medical knowledge sharing across political boundaries. Court records from the Bavarian Voltelsbox reveal another dimension of how genetic problems affected royal family. The dynasty, which ruled Bavaria for centuries, showed patterns of mental illness and physical disability that were carefully documented by court physicians, creating one of the most detailed medical records of royal genetic inheritance available to modern research. The practice of royal women commissioning religious art and architecture often reflected their personal struggles with genetic inheritance and dynastic pressure. Many queens and princesses funded the construction of churches, monasteries, and shrines as acts of devotion related to their experiences with pregnancy loss, child mortality, or their own health challenge. The development of court music therapy during this period was partly driven by observations that certain types of music seemed to calm or improve the condition of royal family members suffering from genetic disorder. Royal patronage of musicians and composers sometimes reflected practical medical considerations as much as aesthetic preferences. The tradition of royal women maintaining detailed household accounts provides insight into the extraordinary medical expenses associated with genetic disorder. These records show payments to numerous physicians, apothecaries, and specialists, revealing the financial burden that genetic problems placed on royal treasuries already strained by ceremonial obligation. The role of royal mistresses became more complex in courts, where genetic problems affected the official royal marriage. In some cases, mistresses were chosen partly because they came from genetically distant populations, offering the possibility of healthier offspring, though these children could never inherit officially due to their illegitimate status. Court entertainments during this period often included performances that subtly referenced the genetic challenges facing royal families, using allegory and symbolism to address topics that couldn't be discussed directly. The theatrical productions, masks, and musical performances provided safe venues for exploring themes related to inheritance, destiny, and divine will. The practice of royal women patronizing medical research led to significant advances in understanding pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care. Queen's colleges and medical schools received royal funding partly because successful treatment of genetic disorders had become a matter of dynastic survival, accelerating medical progress in ways that benefited broader population. The development of specialized royal portraiture techniques reflected the need to represent rulers whose genetic inheritance created physical challenges. Court artists developed sophisticated methods for creating dignified representations that acknowledged reality while maintaining royal mystique, influencing broader developments in artistic technique and aesthetic theory. The phenomenon of royal women serving as unofficial ambassadors became more pronounced when male rulers were incapacitated by genetic disorder. Queens and princesses who could travel and negotiate effectively gained unprecedented diplomatic authority, sometimes
becoming the real power behind thrones occupied by genetically compromised husbands or sons. Court libraries from this period contain extensive collections of medical texts, genealogical studies, and treatises on inheritance, reflecting the intellectual effort devoted to understanding and potentially solving the genetic problems plaguing royal family. These collections represent some of the earliest systematic attempts to study human heredity. The practice of royal families maintaining detailed breeding records, similar to those kept for horses and dogs, reveals the extent to which human reproduction was viewed through the lens of animal husbandry. These documents, preserved in royal archives, provide unprecedented insight into historical attitudes toward genetic inheritance and selective breeding. The role of royal wet nurses evolved to include responsibilities that extended far beyond feeding infants, as these women often became primary caregivers for children whose genetic inheritance created special needs. The selection process for these positions became increasingly sophisticated, with preference given to women from populations believed to possess superior health and vigor. The development of royal medical schools and hospitals was often driven by the desperate need to find treatments for genetic disorders affecting ruling families. The University of Padua, the medical school at Montpellier, and other institutions received royal patronage, partly because of their potential contributions to understanding hereditary health problems. The tradition of royal women writing detailed letters about their pregnancy experiences and child-rearing challenges created an invaluable archive of information about the practical effects of genetic inheritance. These personal documents provide intimate insight into how individual women coped with the medical and emotional challenges of producing heirs within genetically compromised bloodlines. The phenomenon of royal children being raised by relatives rather than their biological parents often reflected genetic problems that made normal family life impossible. Court records show numerous instances of children being transferred between different branches of royal families when their immediate parents were unable to provide adequate care due to their own genetic inheritance. The practice of royal families consulting astrologers and fortune tellers about genetic problems reveals the intersection between superstition and emerging scientific understanding. Court astrologers developed elaborate theories about planetary influences on inheritance, creating alternative explanatory frameworks that provided psychological comfort while obscuring biological reality. The development of specialized royal funeral practices reflected the reality that many members of these families died young or suffered from conditions that affected their appearance. Elaborate embalming techniques, artistic death masks, and carefully choreographed ceremonies were designed to restore dignity and beauty that genetic problems might have compromised in life.
The role of royal pharmacists became increasingly important as courts sought chemical solutions to genetic problems. These specialists, often recruited from across Europe, developed complex preparations intended to treat hereditary conditions, contributing to the advancement of pharmaceutical knowledge even when their specific treatments proved ineffective. The practice of royal women, maintaining extensive correspondence with physicians throughout Europe, created informal networks of medical consultation that transcended political boundaries. These letter exchanges contributed to the gradual development of more sophisticated understanding of hereditary health problems and potential treatments. The phenomenon of royal miracle pregnancies, instances where women who had previously failed to conceive or carry children to term suddenly succeeded, often reflected the desperation with which courts viewed genetic inheritance. These successes were celebrated with extraordinary enthusiasm, though they were often followed by disappointment when the children themselves showed signs of genetic problems. The development of court ceremony around the presentation of royal children reflected the uncertainty about their survival and health. Elaborate baptisms and naming ceremonies served partly as celebrations of successful births in families where healthy offspring couldn't be assumed, creating cultural practices that acknowledged both hope and anxiety about genetic inheritance. The tradition of royal women serving as patrons of orphanages and foundling hospitals often reflected personal experience with child mortality and genetic problems. Queens who had lost children to hereditary conditions frequently devoted themselves to caring for abandoned or orphaned children, finding purpose and emotional healing through these charitable activities. The practice of royal families maintaining multiple physicians with different specialties reflected the complex medical needs created by genetic inheritance. Court medical staffs grew increasingly large and sophisticated, with specialists in various aspects of hereditary health problems, creating some of the most advanced medical practices of their time. The role of royal confessors and counseling families dealing with genetic problems became increasingly complex, as religious advisors struggled to provide theological guidance for situations that challenged traditional teachings about divine providence and family blessing. These spiritual counselors often had to develop new approaches to ministering to rulers, whose genetic inheritance seemed to contradict beliefs about royal divine favor. The development of specialized educational programs for genetically compromised royal heirs represented innovative approaches to preparing disabled individuals for positions of authority. These curricula had to balance traditional royal training with practical accommodations for various disabilities, creating educational methods that influenced broader approaches to teaching individuals with special needs. The practice of royal women commissioning medical treatises and funding research into hereditary conditions contributed significantly to the advancement of medical knowledge. Royal patronage supported some of the earliest systematic studies of human inheritance, genetic disorders, and reproductive health, accelerating scientific progress in ways that benefited entire populations. The phenomenon of royal courts serving as centers for medical innovation reflected the urgent need to find solutions for genetic problems affecting ruling families. The concentration of resources, expertise, and motivation around royal medical needs created environments where significant advances in understanding human heredity and disease could occur. The tradition of royal women maintaining detailed genealogical records extended beyond simple family trees to include medical information about relatives, creating some of the earliest systematic documentation of how genetic traits and disorders were inherited across generations. These records provided crucial data for understanding patterns of hereditary health problems. The practice of royal families consulting multiple religious traditions for solutions to genetic problems reveals the desperation with which they sought answers. Courts that were officially Catholic might secretly consult Protestant physicians, Jewish doctors, or even Islamic scholars if they offered hope for understanding or treating hereditary conditions. The development of court etiquette around genetic disabilities created elaborate protocols designed to maintain royal dignity while accommodating physical and mental limitations. These ceremonial adaptations influenced broader social attitudes toward disability and demonstrated ways that formal institutions could adapt to serve individuals with special needs. The role of royal women as medical record keepers extended to maintaining detailed documentation of treatments, symptoms, and outcomes for various genetic conditions. These records, preserved in royal archives, provide invaluable information for modern medical historians studying the effects of genetic concentration in historical population. The phenomenon of royal families adopting children from genetically distant populations, though rare and usually unofficial, reflected growing awareness that genetic diversity was beneficial. These informal adoptions, often disguised as arrangements for orphaned noble children, represented early recognition of the problems associated with intensive inbreeding. The practice of royal women traveling extensively during pregnancy, ostensibly for health reasons, often reflected attempts to find better medical care or more favorable conditions for childbirth. These travels created informal networks of medical knowledge sharing and contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to prenatal and obstetric care. The tradition of royal courts maintaining extensive libraries of medical texts from across Europe and the Islamic world reflected the international scope of efforts to understand and treat genetic disorders. These collections brought together medical knowledge from different cultural traditions, contributing to the gradual advancement of understanding about human heredity and disease. The development of specialized royal residences designed to accommodate the needs of genetically compromised family members
structures represented innovative approaches to architecture and design. These palaces incorporated features like wheelchair accessibility, specialized lighting, and medical facilities that influenced broader developments in building design for individuals with disability. The practice of royal women serving as informal medical researchers, carefully observing and documenting the effects of various treatments on their own health and that of their children, contributed valuable empirical data to the understanding of genetic disorder. Their detailed observations, recorded in letters and diaries, provided crucial information for medical practitioners. The phenomenon of royal genetic problems influencing art and literature created cultural works that reflected contemporary understanding of heredity and divine will. Paintings, poems, and theatrical works from this period often included subtle references to the genetic challenges facing royal families, creating artistic commentaries on the costs of dynastic politics. The tradition of royal families funding expeditions to seek medical knowledge in distant lands reflected the international scope of efforts to understand genetic inheritance. Royal patronage supported medical missions to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and other regions where different approaches to understanding heredity and treating genetic disorders might be found. The development of court positions specifically dedicated to caring for genetically compromised royal family members created new professional specialties that influenced broader medical practice. These caregivers developed specialized techniques and knowledge that eventually benefited non-royal patients with similar conditions. The practice of royal women maintaining correspondence with learned women throughout Europe created informal networks for sharing information about pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare in the context of genetic challenges. These letter exchanges contributed to the development of more sophisticated understanding of reproductive health and hereditary conditions. The phenomenon of royal courts becoming centers for the development of prosthetics and adaptive devices reflected the practical needs created by genetic disability. Royal patronage supported craftsmen and inventors who developed assistive technologies that eventually became available to broader populations with similar needs. As we conclude this examination of royal bloodlines and their human costs, we must recognize that the women who lived through these experiences were more than victims of political circumstance. They were individuals who found ways to create meaning, exert influence, and leave lasting legacies despite the constraints imposed by dynastic necessity and genetic inheritance. Their stories remind us that behind every grand historical narrative are personal tales of courage, adaptation, and the persistent human drive to find dignity and purpose, even within the most challenging circumstances.